Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Pogue, and thanks very much for being here for my talk this afternoon on the holistic stewardship of agricultural systems for ecosystem services and biodiversity, looking beyond climate regulation. And I'm joining you today from Treaty 7 lands in southern Alberta. I need to give special thanks to Pam Mantle, who's part of the HOLOS team at AFC in Lethbridge, for all of her help in putting this together. This was definitely a joint effort. Next slide, please. So climate change is, of course, a significant challenge that we are facing, and it can affect different communities in different ways. This graphic highlights some climate change impacts throughout Canada. For example, the warming climate in northern regions it can lead to permafrost degradation, negatively affecting northern infrastructure, and reduced reliability of ice roads affecting access to northern communities. Other impacts can include increased rates of species loss or shifts in species ranges, or changing weather patterns that expand the range of certain diseases. And all of these can, of course, be associated with significant economic costs. Next slide, please. However, as a society, we also need to direct sufficient attention to other ways in which human activities impact the health and well-being of people and nature, including via our agricultural practices. The regulation of climate is just one of what can be termed ecosystem services, and these are commonly defined as the direct and indirect benefits people obtain from ecosystems. These are often divided into provisioning services, which we can see in the top center on this slide, and they include things like food, fuel, and water. Regulating services on the left that affect the climate, water, soil, and air quality, and cultural services on the right, things like recreational activities, aesthetic value, and spiritual benefits. Agricultural systems are important providers of many ecosystem services, including, of course, food, but also climate regulation through carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat provision, and scenic landscapes. Thus, agricultural systems affect and are affected by ecosystem service provision. This is not an exhaustive list. Not all services will be relevant to every system or every context. And there's also no ranking of services here from the most to the least important, as their importance or significance can vary depending on the system in question, on people's needs, their cultural values, their social norms, etc. What we do know is that people need many different services to live safe, healthy, and happy lives. Next slide, please. I just want to point out that the ecosystem services framework is sometimes criticized as being very human-centered, as it does primarily revolve around understanding how our interactions with nature can affect the supply of different services and ultimately different aspects of human well-being. However, this does not exclude wider considerations of the natural world and all of the life that it contains. In the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, which was a landmark report on ecosystem change and human health that was published in 2005, it explicitly states that although the Millennium Assessment emphasizes the linkages between ecosystems and human well-being, it recognizes that the actions people take that influence ecosystems result not just from concern about human well-being, but also from considerations of the intrinsic value of species and ecosystems, where intrinsic value is the value of something in and for itself, irrespective of its utility for someone else. Next slide, please. Understanding the complex interactions between people and nature in agricultural systems presents many challenges, including how to measure or monitor the provision of services in response to agricultural practices and other drivers of change. Across a large country like Canada, with an agricultural zone that spans multiple soil types, climate zones, and with substantial variation in management practices, one way in which we can do this is via Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's agri-environmental indicators. These indicators integrate large amounts of information on soils, climate, and topography, with statistics on land use and crop and livestock management practices, to provide measures of key environmental conditions affected by ag management practices. On this slide, I've included just a couple of examples. At the top, we have the 2021 map for the risk of water contamination by nitrogen indicator. And this represents the proportion of residual soil nitrogen that can be lost from agricultural land into waterways. This risk varies throughout the country, and in 2021, it was generally highest where both residual soil nitrogen and precipitation were high. And we can see this in the darker areas on that map. At the bottom, we have the wildlife habitat capacity for breeding indicator, which measures how much suitable breeding habitat there is for wildlife on Canada's farmland. This is based on the land cover types different species need for breeding, the amount of land of each of these land cover types in the Canadian agricultural landscape. Next slide, please. The effects of ag practices on agricultural productivity and other services across space and time can also be examined via multi-year and multi-site field studies. Although such studies typically require large inputs of time, money, and labor, they can provide significant insights into human nature interactions in these systems. So AFC's Living Labs projects represent such an initiative. Specifically here, I'm talking about the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs, which run from 2021 to I think about 2026, 2027. From the map on this slide, we can see that there are 14 of these projects spread across Canada. Each living lab brings together farmers, scientists, and other sector stakeholders to examine how different on-farm practices can sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in real-world conditions. Although there is a large focus in these projects on climate regulation through carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions, many of the projects also examine other environmental co-benefits, such as biodiversity, nutrient management, and water quality. Next slide. So as one example, the Central Prairies Living Lab focuses primarily on 4 agricultural management strategies adopted on working farms, and these are detailed across the top of the slide. So firstly, we have avoiding land conversion, where native and naturalized landscapes are retained, including native and tame grasslands, wetlands, or wooded areas. Managing grazing impacts by manipulating the timing and intensity of grazing and rest in native and tame rangelands. Promoting perennials through the restoration and rejuvenation of perennial grassland communities. And polycropping, where croplands are planted with diverse species blends to use as forage or fodder for livestock. And in response to these practices, Living Lab researchers examine the outcomes for soils, for example, by measuring soil carbon, moisture, and microbial communities. For plants, including understanding how these practices can affect plant community composition and productivity. For animals, not just livestock, but also wild animals, such as insects and birds. And these living labs also examine the interactions between all of these components to understand how they affect different environmental, social, and economic sustainability indicators. Next slide. This map just shows the locations of the Central Prairies Living Lab sites. These are mainly found in central and southern Saskatchewan, in the brown, dark brown, and black soil zones. And it should be noted that not all management practices and not all outcomes are investigated at each site. Next slide. Using models to explore the potential impacts of human activities on ecosystem services is also a useful tool and a complement to field and lab-based studies. We should also acknowledge that modeling initiatives can also have large data needs that can require significant computing power, and they need time and expertise. One example of an ecosystem service modeling study is detailed in this publication by Detrompe et al. 2025, which describes the outcomes of their model-based study on how forest restoration on agricultural land in the Montérégie region of Quebec could influence the supply of ecosystem services. So in the main figure on this slide, we can see a land cover map of the study region as it currently is, so that is before any forest restoration is examined. The main land cover type is cropland. This is the yellowish color, followed by forested land in green, which is mainly in the eastern and southern areas. In total, 9 different management scenarios were modeled, where the authors explored the influence of forest restoration extent, spatial configuration, and the original agricultural site conditions on the supply of 7 different ecosystem services. These included provisioning services, such as crop and maple syrup production, regulating services such as carbon storage and water quality regulation, and cultural or non-tangible services such as deer hunting and outdoor recreation. Next slide, please. This series of maps depicts the spatial distribution of these 7 ecosystem services for the baseline conditions, so without any forest restoration. It shows that in general, ecosystem service supply is spatially aligned with land use and land cover categories. So for example, crop production in the top center map in green, This was highest in fields close to natural and forested patches, and lowest for fields that were surrounded primarily by other cropland. Pollination potential in the bottom left map in pink was also highest near patches of natural vegetation, and this possibly explains the higher crop yields in these areas. Water quality regulation in the center left map, that kind of pale blue map, this was less effective in urban areas, where lower values in the darker blue areas represent lower water quality regulation capacity. Next slide, please. In this figure, we can see a summary of some of the model outputs for the 9 forest restoration scenarios, where the ecosystem services are specified on the horizontal axis, and the type of field restored and the extent of restoration is on the vertical axis. It's not surprising that when agricultural fields are restored to forest, there is a decline in agricultural production, which we can see in the red column on the left. Although productivity losses can be minimized by restoring abandoned fields rather than degraded or random agricultural fields. For most other services, their supply or capacity generally increases as more area is restored to forest, and this is depicted in the top rows of the blue columns, but we should note that these trends can vary across the landscape. Overall, this type of research can highlight the importance of identifying and prioritizing marginal lands within agricultural landscapes for potential forest restoration, with the aim of enhancing the supply of multiple ecosystem services without causing significant declines in agricultural production. Next slide, please. So the interactions between different ecosystem services and biodiversity can be complex, and they can be context specific. And actions to enhance one service can lead to an increase or a decrease in other services. To illustrate this, we can look to a couple of recent studies that were published in 2025, and these focused on tidal wetlands and coastal protection systems in the Bay of Fundy on the Atlantic coast. In this region, inhabited coastal systems are at risk from climate change-related impacts, such as sea level rise, storm surges, and saltwater intrusion. The Mi'kmaq people have resided in this region since time immemorial, but beginning in the 1600s, French settlers converted much of the coast's tidal wetlands to agricultural dike lands. And this means agricultural land that is reclaimed from tidal wetlands via the construction of dike systems that hold back seawater. And the top right map depicts the location of these dike lands in green. However, these dike systems are no longer always adequate to protect the land behind them from storm surges and flooding. And so there have been calls for more nature-based coastal solutions, such as managed dike realignment. And this is where the hard dike infrastructure is retained in key locations, but it is moved landward so that there is more seaward room for tidal wetland restoration. And this is depicted in the photo in the center. You can see the dike being moved backwards towards the land, and there is more room for wetland restoration on the seaward side. Therefore, Cornejo et al., and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing all of these names, they used a collaboratively developed conceptual model to explore the effects of different coastal protection systems. And specifically, they asked, what are the ecosystem service trade-offs and synergies between restored tidal wetlands and agricultural dike lands in the Bay of Fundy after managed dike realignment? Next slide, please. So from the outputs of this publication, we can look at this rather complicated figure that depicts the relationships between the different components of the system following the proposed managed dike realignment. These components include landscape features such as the dike lands themselves and restored tidal wetlands. And these are represented by the rectangles. Ecological features and processes such as sediment accretion or total wetland vegetation, and these are in the oval shapes. And the ecosystem services or values such as storm and flood protection or bird watching, and those are in the round-edged rectangles. Next slide, please. We can highlight a few potential consequences for ecosystem services of the managed dike realignment process. For example, ecosystem services that are enhanced by restored wetlands, but that could decrease with farmed dike lands are indicated here in green on the top. And these include blue carbon, which could increase due to increased sediment accretion following wetland restoration, fisheries, relevant elements from Mi'kmaq cultural practices such as sweetgrass production and seasonal fishing and hunting, as well as bird habitat, which could expand as the wetlands are restored. Conversely, services that are enhanced by farmed dikelands, but that could decrease with wetland restoration, are indicated in blue towards the bottom. And these include education and knowledge systems, heritage value, and social relations associated with the dikelands, as well as food crop and forage production. Next slide, please. There could also be synergies, indicated here by the orange shapes, where restored tidal wetlands, dikes, and dikelands can all provide the same or similar ecosystem services. And these are mostly non-material services, such as inspiration and art, sense of place, recreation and tourism, and aesthetics. However, we should note that the capacity of a system to provide each of these may differ considerably depending on the values, perspectives, and culture of individuals or communities. So, for example, aesthetic value is very much in the eye of the beholder. Some people may find the wetlands more aesthetically pleasing, while others would rather look at the dikelands. Next slide, please. In some studies, given that managed dike realignment could lead to tidal wetland restoration, while also retaining at least some of the agricultural dikeland inland, with both the wetlands and the dikes offering some coastal storm and flood protection, this management practice could be seen as a win-win scenario. However, Wells et al. In their 2025 paper reported that, based on their interviews with Mi'kmaq people in this region, there was an overall affinity for the removal of the dike systems that interrupt water flow and obstruct habitat, and for the restoration of these areas to wetlands. In some excerpts from this paper in the yellow box on the right, the study participants stressed their preference for wetland restoration and advised that, if carried out, this should be done in a sustainable way, but they also indicated that the decision process is complex and must involve all impacted communities. Studies like this highlight the importance of holistic models and assessments of such complex social ecological systems, which consider a range of voices and sources of knowledge, including Indigenous voices and knowledge systems, to better understand the potential impacts of land management or stewardship, both now and into the future. They also help to address a frequent shortcoming in ecosystem service research, and that is a lack of focus on the flow of ecosystem services to specific people and communities, and the resulting impacts of changes in service delivery on both human and non-human well-being. Next slide, please. So for my last slide, I just wanted to highlight that when we talk about the impacts of agricultural activities on human and ecosystem well-being, this of course includes the impacts on farmer or producer health and well-being in all its various forms. Megan can speak more authoritatively about this in the next talk, but just to provide one example of an initiative that is attempting to support farmers in their efforts to adopt sustainable farming practices, we can take a look at the IDEA Quebec framework, which is illustrated in this figure. This framework uses data from farmers and producers to help to identify the strengths and challenges of farms based on 30 indicators that assess three main priorities: ensuring farm viability and livability, preserving natural resources, and responding to societal and territorial challenges. The resulting portrait of the farm allows farmers, assisted by their farm advisor, to develop a common vision of their farm and an action plan to make the farm more sustainable. This framework includes a wide range of indicators, they're all listed in this figure, to assess environmental sustainability of the farm, for example, based on indicators surrounding soil health, biodiversity, and greenhouse gases, economic sustainability via debt ratio and labor productivity indicators, and social sustainability using indicators based on farmer relationships with consumers and with other farms in the area. I just wanted to highlight this initiative as it also includes metrics on the bottom left that specifically relate to farmer quality of life, such as job satisfaction and pace of life. Next slide, please. Just some references, and then next slide. Thank you very much, everyone. I'll stop right there.